Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Building Educator Capacity, a podcast by CESA 2, where we strive to improve student learning by expanding the capacity of our school districts. I'm Mitchell Lilly, and I'm joined once again by Phil Anderson.
This is a great one we have today, Mitchell. I'm super excited to get this episode out.
Absolutely, and a special note about this podcast episode number 6, is the first episode that we're actually able to record in person together.
It's great to be able to see you in person.
So it is a special episode. Today we have two of our CESA 2 consultants joined by Dr. Eddie Moore, once again talking about equity, a very important topic in our region and across the nation.
So Dr. Eddie Moore Jr. has found success in academia, business, diversity, leadership, and community service. He received his PhD in Educational Policy and Leadership Studies at the University of Iowa. In 1996, he started America and More, LLC, to provide comprehensive diversity, privilege, and leadership training and workshops. Under his direction and inclusive relationship model, the White Privilege Conference has become one of the top national and international conferences for participants who want to move beyond dialogue and into action around issues of diversity, power, privilege, and leadership. In 2014, Dr. Moore founded the Privilege Institute, which engages people in research, education, action, and leadership through workshops, conferences, publications, and collaborative partnerships and relationships. We also have our CESA 2 consultants. Gretchen Lettau joined CESA 2 as the consultant in the Language and Culture Center of Excellence, supporting the areas of language acquisition, English learners, and dual language education. Gretchen has worked as a teacher and coordinator for 16 years with culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Gretchen has taught EL classes for the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh as an adjunct professor, a member of the statewide WIAB work group, and served as a member of Governor Evers' Advisory Council to support linguistically diverse students nationwide committee. Kim Stieber-White joined CESA 2 with deep knowledge and expertise in social justice, technology, and literacy. Her experience in schools spans urban, suburban, and rural settings and includes classroom, English language arts, a reading specialist, library media specialist, technology integrator, and instructional coach. Kim is in the process of completing a PhD in educational leadership and policy analysis with a focus on literacy and equity.
Well, Dr. Moore, hello and welcome to our podcast today, focusing on equity in Wisconsin school districts. You are a nationally recognized expert in equity, and we are fortunate to have you in our state, to have your expertise on the podcast this morning. But you're also a Wisconsin resident, and you happen to be my neighbor to the north in Green Bay. So to start off our conversation today, would you share with our listeners a description of the equity situation in Wisconsin school districts?
Yeah, well, when I think about it in three areas. One, I think kids. I mean, what we're seeing in Wisconsin, and I think especially in Green Bay, where I live, is increasing diversity. I mean, that's what's happening. Is the student population is changing. It's becoming more and more diverse. So that's one thing that's happening. And tied close to that is teachers. I mean, the educators, where we're seeing the opposite in many cases, that we're not going to be seeing the kind of people of color, administrators of color, that we may have hoped for in our school buildings over the next 25 years. And so that's another category. And then I think curriculum is the other area that's really important. I think as you have designed a school and a school curriculum for a different audience of people, i.e., 100 years ago in many cases, but definitely in the last 50 years, that now you have different clientele, you should be having some expanded curriculum material to address, to connect with, to help enhance the learning and excellence of that population as well. So I think we're at an interesting juncture when it comes to curriculum, as well as we see increasing students of color, not so much in educators and teachers of color, or our teacher population in general. And then, of course, I think a need to be able to really service, provide excellence, provide education to a population in many cases, many folks have never experienced or been exposed to. I do think it's worth mentioning parents as another just extra component when it comes to equity, mainly because the makeup of the parent body, the parent, the guardian, whoever that may be, whether it's across gender, gender identity, whether it's across race, I just think we're going to be seeing a new wave of parents and possibly parenting styles showing up in our school buildings as well. And I think we just have to, as educators, those of us here in Wisconsin, just have to be in tune with those 3 or 4 things as we think about equity. But those are the things I've been noticing, especially in Green Bay where I live, but also as I've been, making my way across the state, doing some work in different places.
Can you tell us, just from your observations in various districts across the state, if you see any differences and or similarities when you think about types of districts? Wisconsin is filled with rural districts and suburban districts and has some urban districts.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good, just really clear and specific category to think about it. I mean, you do have literally in Wisconsin, I mean, school districts, as they used to say, that are out there in the boonies. So, again, I don't, where I grow frustrated is sometimes people equate that with possibly less than and unwilling to, really address some of the kind of issues that I work on. But sometimes I found some of the most courageous leadership and some openness to some learning in some of the rural spaces and places. And I think also you have, this somewhat of an urban core, although in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, outside of Milwaukee, maybe Madison, that could be, seen a little bit different. But yeah, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be seeing all of those things change. I know in the places where I really built my skill sets and my knowledge around these issues in Iowa, I mean, many of those districts you visit now that were rural have combined, have consolidated, and really become somewhat of an urban center now. So I think it's going to be really interesting in a lot of places across the Midwest in general, but specifically in Wisconsin, what rural looks like, what schools look like, school districts look like, as we continue to see, as I mentioned earlier, this shift, this change, this somewhat of a migration of folks of color coming more and more to different schools and school districts and communities that they haven't always been in. And, some folks somewhat maybe wanting to escape the city life, so to speak, the urban life, and really, be in some places where it's more affordable and, kids can ride their bike to school, that kind of thing. So I think we're really going to be in an interesting next 10 years when it comes to what schools and school communities even look like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And what you're just saying really mirrors the things I've seen over the years as an educator in Wisconsin, but also being from Iowa. I can just imagine the things that you're talking about too. So I'm curious, what do you recommend? What can school districts do to improve equity for students and really thinking about all these shifting pieces that are happening right now?
Well, I mean, in my honest opinion, the one real thing missing from the work of equity in our schools in the 21st century, and I think especially if we look at what I'm looking at the next 25 years, is consequences, accountability. I mean, literally, you can fail a half of the kids are part of some demographics in your school district, and there's no consequence, there's no penalty. I mean, I think that we have got to have some kind of level of accountability when it comes to school failure. And I'm not a cancel culture guy unless you do something that deserves canceling. That's not what I'm saying. But I do think if you for 10 years or 20 years had the kind of numbers we're seeing some schools, some school districts have, that there should be some reckoning, some accountability, something. So I think that's number one, that schools got to be thinking about what does accountability, what does what does failing large populations of students over large amounts of time mean? Can we keep doing this? So I think that's number one. I think also that metrics are important, goals are important. I think as people, I sometimes grow frustrated because I think people always know what the deficits are, what the gaps are, what the inequities are. And I think that's important. But what are your goals to close those gaps? What is it that you're trying to do? I think sometimes it feels like there's an absence of a place you're trying to get to when it comes to metrics. And whether that's hiring more faculty or educators or teachers of color, whether that's having more students of color, BIPOC students, and gifted and talented, whether that's curbing some of your disciplinary or discipline inequities and referrals. I think we need a real commitment to metrics. And sometimes that's hard because people think you're talking about quotas and things to that effect. But I just think goals and metrics are important when we talk about equity as well. And then the last thing I'll say is leadership. I think we really need, and it's a really important time as we look at some of the challenges we've seen just in this last year with COVID and pandemic, but also all the racial, social justice issues that are not going to go away, that are going to continue to come into our school buildings, that school leadership is going to be critical. And I think not just at the highest level of superintendent, but also the building principals, the assistant principals, the coaches. I mean, I think there's some people who are playing key leadership roles that often only get perks when they win or when they lose, so to speak, but need to be a part of participating in really the goals of equity, which I think should be a comprehensive goal. So those are some of the things that I think about right now when I think about what schools can be doing when it comes to equity, leadership, accountability, as well as really an applying of some kind of metrics and talking about this is where we want to be in the next 10 years.
Thank you for that. To follow up, when we think about how teachers and leaders should be thinking about equity moving forward, you mentioned an accountability piece and some long-term goals for sure, and the metrics. How can we make that switch from deficit-based thinking around those metrics to asset-based thinking and the excellence that students bring to us? And how do we go about that shift in thinking and action with teachers and administrators?
Yeah, it's going to be a real important piece as we look at, some of the challenges on the horizon and some of the opportunities, I think, as a parent of a Black son of two multiracial kids, a part of me is happy my kids will be able to walk to school. Those are some of the perks we have here, but I'm sending them to a school possibly where there's just some real incompetence, some real inexperience. And so, right now, I feel like what Brian Stevenson talks about is this real proximity phenomenon that it helps to be in connection with people of color, with with the people that you're going to be serving or collaborating with, or in some ways trying to reach your goals. And that's one of the things that I think is going to be continuing to challenge us in the 21st century, these next 25 years, that if you haven't had experience with Black excellence, Black genius, if the only way you know Black people is through trouble or through athletics, right? If that's your only proximity, that's going to be a real hurdle for me who has a son who's thinking about Mars and space, right? Like you got to be able to see that 10-year-old, that 11-year-old and think astronaut, not baseball or football. And I think that's going to be one really important piece as we look at really trying to obtain excellence, trying to bring these students, these diverse student bodies, these diverse students to a higher level, trying to accomplish some of the goals that we're talking about the goal of teaching and educating is you have got to be able to see it in the young kid. You got to be able to name it. And I think that that's some of what's missing, some of what is absent from the teacher population. And I don't know if I'm more frustrated right now with the current teacher population or the teacher preparation programs that are putting teachers in these school buildings. Now, let me say this. It's not that these are bad people. I'm not saying that these are evil people, although unfortunately, we do got some people that I wonder, what are you doing in this school building? Now, I will acknowledge that, but by and large, my experience has been there are good people with good hearts that I'm encountering firsthand in my kids' school building, but just haven't had the experience, the exposure. And so I think there's got to be some real effort made to provide some of that personal development, professional development, but also the challenge of this ability to see Black excellence, as I refer to it, Black genius, to see them in that position is something I don't think, one, we're talking a whole lot about, we're naming, and two, that we're doing a lot of things about in reference to challenging, informing, and enhancing teachers around that issue.
Dr. Moore, so how can teachers, especially white teachers and white leaders, do that? What can they do differently?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is James Baldwin said it more eloquently than I'll say it, but I mean, you can't change it if you can't name it, basically the essence of what he's saying. Like, I mean, we have got to be talking about a real tough issue, a real difficult issue in schools that hasn't and doesn't often get discussed, and that's white supremacy. That's white supremacist ideology. Keep in mind, we're only in the conversation we're in the ways that we're partnering, collaborating around the things that we're doing together as educators, as educational leaders, because people had to die to make it happen. People fought, had to literally put their lives on the line so our kids could possibly be in the same school buildings together, so we could even work together. That in many cases, people are there by force. I think that there is got to be some real, I think, some challenging conversations around the fact that there is anti-Black racist ideology in the foundational structure of schooling, public schooling, especially here in America and in Wisconsin, particularly just because of the founding of the state, just how white it is, how unexposed it is, how inexperienced it is when it comes to diversity. Now, again, I want to make a caveat that that doesn't mean that all the people are white supremacists. All the people are buying in and supporting this ideology. Although some of us do know some folks who are often in our buildings around our kids carrying some of these thoughts. But if that's a part of the foundational development, that we can't change it to be more anti-racist, more inclusive, more belonging, if we don't ever discuss how it got started. You know, I was listening to a very interesting interview the other day about the Tulsa Wall Street, Black Wall Street, and what's happening in Tulsa. And the mayor was saying that really for 90 plus years, they never talked about it. They literally pushed it under the rug. that in the last 5 years, they've had more knowledge exposed around Tulsa than they have in the past 95 years. It just really speaks, it really spoke to me about just the absence of some real understanding of the challenges that are still a part of what we're facing. And I think that's what's going to be really important for white educators, especially, is a willingness to acknowledge, a willingness to be willing to say, this is work that I have to do. And I think that with that willingness, there can be some learning, and there can be some becoming more comprehensive, more understanding. And we see it all the time. I've seen it in my family where people, because of exposure, because of conversations, because of interactions, there's been evolvement, there's been openness. But where there's denial, there continues to be disparities, inequities, and I argue destruction when it comes to primarily kids of color.
So we want to make sure that our listeners have some action steps related to equity. So when we think particularly about our white educators and leaders in education, what are some resources and organizations that we can look to do some of this learning once we've acknowledged that we need to?
Yeah, well, I think there's some great educational scholars out there with some swagger. You know what I mean? Like Bettina Love and her abolitionist teaching network. I believe I'm pronouncing that right. ATN, basically. Phenomenal. Just creative, innovative. That's someone I think about right away, just as a resource in so many ways. Gholdy Muhammad, another sister, just really helping white teachers with just this Black excellence, Black genius, like the ability to see BIPOC students and believe that there's excellence there, and how to embed that in your curriculum and your teaching and your personal development as well. I think Brother Chris Emdin and his use of hip hop music, right, and bringing that into the curriculum is really important. Some really important work. Those are, just a couple, three quick national, international figures I think about. Let's not forget about our local resource of our great elder, Gloria Lassens Billings, who's just produced. She's like the Lil Wayne of research when it comes to education. You know what I'm saying? Just has produced so much, impacted so many, and still, just one of the most brilliant minds out there. That's right here, really, right in our Midwest background, our backyard, so to speak. I do feel I need to acknowledge, the Privilege Institute, the organization that I founded in the White Privilege Conference, which we feel is one of the places and spaces for people who really want to go to the highest level of examining these issues. As y'all know, especially across the Midwest, there's just a lot of people, again, really just getting started with the work. And I think that's what's been great about this year, although there's been some real pain and some real difficult things that have had to happen for people to really come to some willingness around this work. But I do think we're at an opportune time in which people are saying, okay, what can I do? What can I do? And so I think while we're at that time, a lot of us got to fill that in. And there can be some local, there can be some regional, there can be some national. But I do think that people got to be willing to keep growing, to keep going to another level when it comes to competency around these issues. And that's what we're trying to have the White Privilege Conference, the Privilege Institute be, is really an organization that when you're ready to go beyond diversity and inclusion, kind of diversity 101, we can offer some programming ideas, and some conference space so you can do that as well. I also have to mention the 21-day action plan, mainly because we've just seen so much success with the 21-day action plan, which is, again, after you listen to this podcast, if you're moved in any way, and you want to do something, okay, well, here's something you can do. One thing a day, 21 days in a row. It's not the be all, end all. I'm not saying it's the magic formula in any way. It's not some Poppy the magic troll wand that you're going to wave and everything's going to be better. However, it'll get you started in that direction. And so that's another tool that is really just tangible and free that people can look up, go on the website, my website, eddiemorejr.com, and just start working on these issues already. Last thing I would say in reference to things that people can do is really trying to be in partnership with someone. I mean, I think it's great to, take some self, reflective, individual kind of effort around these issues. But I know for me, as a learner, I do that better when I can bounce that off a colleague or be in partnership with someone. I think just remembering the days of, always wanting to get in shape. I mean, I liked going to the gym by myself, right? But it was so much easier when I knew somebody was waiting on me and we were going to be working out together. I think we could take this partnership collaboration model as a way to think about really, holding yourself accountable or being in partner with somebody, being in partnership with someone as you participate in that growth. And so I would also suggest that to educators, to teachers as well.
Dr. Moore, thank you so much. Those are really helpful steps that we can take. And I just want to thank you for your time today, for this conversation.
Yes, thank you for your time and expertise.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the opportunity. I just have to make one last statement to the young people out there in case there's any hanging by the side of their educator parent or administrative parent. Listen, I think there is a role that young people have to play in this effort as we're looking at equity, as we're looking at diversity over the next 25 years across Wisconsin. And one thing I always tell young people is the best friend that hate has is silence. Is that we have got to be willing to, again, call out racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. We can't just let these jokes, these comments, these little, what some people call microaggressions or micro cuts, these incidences just go on and go by. And so I just really want to say to young people, you don't have to solve it. But one thing I want to just ask you to make sure you do, that you don't sit quietly and let it pass by. And so that's the message I will leave with the youngest of the listening audience, because I hope some of them or some of you listening can share with them, we need them to stand up. In the words of Bob Marley, get up, stand up when you hear, some of that ugly stuff out there, because hate loves silence. And so I want to close with that. And again, appreciate y'all for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
A lot of important, actionable takeaways out of that conversation.
Absolutely. And being aware is all part of the process. As Maya Angelou, American poet and civil rights activist, said, do the best you can until you know better. When you know better, do better.
For sure, and that means understanding what white privilege means and how to create a more inclusive, equitable community in our schools. To learn more about Dr. Eddie Moore's conference and to access the recommended resources, visit our podcast description. Many thanks to Liz Elliott, band teacher at Whitewater Middle School in Whitewater, Wisconsin, for the music in this episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.